Okay, look, hopefully nobody's expecting much from Big Bang Theory, because I'm certainly not. This show is renowned for having incredibly sexist, racist, homophobic jokes just littered throughout basically its whole run. And even when it wasn't doing the lowest common denominator form of comedy, it was consistently pulling the cheapest tricks possible to avoid having to be an interesting show. And that's coming from someone who has tried watching it 3 times all the way through. Big Bang Theory was the show that broke this camel's back. And yet, here we are. Because even with all of that said, this was still an incredibly popular show. One of the most popular shows of its time, with huge ratings and appeal and paychecks for its cast, that only stopped because some of the people involved wanted to call it quits. Big Bang Theory could have kept going. It could have gone on forever. And so we need to understand, as an audience, what exact impact this titan of the media landscape had when it came to trans people. Because trans people are affected by the way that shows like this decide to, well, show us. Are affected by how super mainstream popcorn-esque TV depicts us to those who consume and subconsciously interpret those jokes into their lives. I dread to acknowledge such a fact, but Big Bang Theory is an important building block in the conversation I'm trying to build on this channel. And hopefully, it's one that might get little old me some of those clicks. Now, all of this might come off as a rather biased opinion going in. I mean, it sounds like I hate this show, and so I want to quickly reassure people that yes, anything I say is biased by the pure fact that it's my subjective interpretation of things. You might love Big Bang Theory, and nothing I say or could ever say will be able to take away your own reasons for that from you. All I hope to do here is provide some insight into a particular side of the show that I've not seen many other people do, and inspire self-reflection and introspection for those Big Bang heads or whatever you call yourselves. For everybody else, feel free to treat this as some of that beloved hate-watching that inspires so much engagement. That's also perfectly fine by me. So we've quibbled and quabbled our way through what amounts to an introduction, and now it's time to get into the gritty, hard facts of the show, and for me to stop stalling because I don't want to watch these episodes and read these scripts again. Our first thing to focus on here is something that isn't even trans, but it does set the stage for seeing where the trans stuff, i.e. trans jokes and transphobia, come into play down the line. And that is the treatment of the character Rajesh, especially in regards to his relation with firstly Howard and then Stuart. Now, here is something to clear the air first and foremost. From every single resource that I can find, every single piece of information I can dig up, canonically speaking, none of these 3 men are gay. Not Raj, not Howard, and not even Stuart. There is one gay guy on the show, Blaine, from Season 2's Episode 3, The Barbarian Sublimation, who features in a single joke involving Sheldon, and who is mocked by the nerd group mercilessly for his interest in Sheldon.
Can I have your phone number?
Yeah.
Now, while that might be technically one of, if not the only inclusions of characters who are gay or bisexual or whatever, gay people do feature as an idea in a much bigger format. That of how Raj is mocked by others or interpreted by outsiders, especially around firstly Howard, until Howard gets into a long-term relationship, and afterwards Stuart.
He doesn't have a girlfriend, I don't have a girlfriend.
It's like we both had these holes in our lives, but now we fill each other's holes.
A big central theme of Raj-based jokes is his femininity, and willingness to embrace exploits that might be considered outside of the scope of stereotypical masculinity. Something that the members of the nerd gang cling to in an extremely toxic manner, with their status as nerds being used as almost a deflection of criticism over how they represent these truly reprehensible ideas. something that you can find very well covered in Pop Culture Detective's 2-part video series on the Big Bang Theory, and something that I would absolutely advise that you go and watch if you have the time. This video is almost a continuation of the thing that they started or set up, so, it's definitely a good idea to watch those. But alongside this aggressive assault on any expression of femininity, femininity that is also mixed up as well in Raj's Indian heritage, and that combined aspect being a big part of the mockery that the show leaned into significantly, alongside that is the way that it takes these codependent single male friends in the direction of homosexual tendencies, and then derives a cruel enjoyment from making them squirm over it for the audience's pleasure.
It might explain why the two of you have created an ersatz homosexual marriage to satisfy your need for intimacy.
Now, what does this have to do with trans stuff in the Big Bang Theory? I hear you mutter under your breath. And don't you dare think you can get away with back-talking me, you little so-and-so. I'll see you after class for detention. And it has everything to do with the trans aspects. These pieces of information set the scene for us, not only in establishing the way that femininity amongst men is viewed as weakness, as a character flaw, as something to be criticised over and harassed for, but it also gives us an insight into how well the show handled a different queer group, and that, combined with our discussion of the transness, will hopefully lay a convincing foundation for seeing the Big Bang Theory as a huge reflection of the cis-straight mainstream audiences that isolate and diminishes outside voices in favour of bigotry.
What are you doing?
Don't worry, you'll thank me. Hello, Lalita, Raj, good
I want to save probably that conversation a little bit more for the conclusion, but just know that this all served a purpose. And with that said, let's actually get into the trans stuff. So, where do we start? Do we have a trans episode, perhaps, to dive into? Or nice and neatly centered around one entry, so I can call this the Trans Big Bang Theory episode? Fuck no. Come on. A trans episode in Big Bang Theory? Right after I told you how fucked gay people got in this show? No way they were going to give us one of those. It only ran for 12 seasons right up until literally just a few years ago. How dare you expect queer identities taking any kind of stage at all except for us to laugh at them? You fool! Big Bang Theory, come on. So, one way in which trans people are included in the Big Bang Theory is as bits or punchlines for characters to use to get a laugh from the cruel audience. Now, I am not going to be talking about every single time that this happened in the show, because I want to make this as clear as possible. Comprehensive is irrelevant when concise will do the trick. Please do not bring up the 10-hour Harry Potter video when I say that, because just don't, okay? So our first example of trans people being used in dialogue by characters as a joke is from Season 2's episode 22, The Classified Materials Turbulence. Of course, to that you might be saying, well hang on, isn't there like a transphobic joke within the first episode of the entire show? Like it's one of the earliest jokes made? And holster that gun for a second there, cowboy. I'll be talking about that in its own chapter in just a second, alright? Back to the bit we want to talk about. A big part of this episode is the fact that Penny, the main and only girl at this point in the show, is dating Stuart. And Stuart is asking for advice from Leonard, who is the main nerd, and Leonard is dealing with the fact that he is not over Penny, and is still into her, because that whole will they, won't they is sort of a driving plot point for a while.
Interesting. Penny's current suitor asking advice from her former suitor.
Yeah, thanks for closed captioning my pain, Raj.
Like Ross and Rachel from Friends, but somehow with even more bigoted jokes shoved in. Us white people sure know how to make undeserving shows the dominant cultural monolith on the media landscape, don't we? Anyways, Leonard gives what he thinks is bad advice to Stuart, and so he feels terrible for it, and goes to apologise to Stuart over that. which, as he leaves to go and do, we get a little snippet from Howard showcasing that exact same toxic masculinity that pop culture detective clearly laid out as being quite consistent in this show.
Why does Leonard get to go?
Because he's upset over his situation with Penny, and if I have to hear about it again, I'm gonna kick him in his ovaries.
And during his conversation with Stuart, when Stuart explains why the date ended poorly, the reason being that Penny said Leonard's name during the makeout, he drops this little line about how the date could have gone worse based on a presumably past experience.
That must have been the last thing you wanted to hear.
Well, it beats you know I'm a dude, right?
Now, there are two ways to look at this joke as being not good. I mean, I suppose there's also a way to look at it as, it's just a joke, brah, why are you making such a big deal about it? But if I had that attitude, it would defeat the whole point of this video and this channel. If that's how you feel, then what are you doing here? So, for the rest of the people, the first way to look at this is the obvious one of how one of the worst things that could happen for a cis straight guy on a date is to find out that his paramour is a trans woman. And saying, I'm a guy you know, is something that trans women did a lot of in straight cis shows from this time period. Like, they would not acknowledge themselves as a woman because they were being written by guys who didn't see them like that, and therefore didn't write them to be consistent with the trans community's understanding of ourselves. Yeah, who'd have thunk that, like, actually involving people in a process would let you avoid shit like that? But of course, that's not what Big Bang Theory is about. Now, this way of looking at it really follows the same transphobia that has been illustrated by me, no less, in videos about Ace Ventura, How I Met Your Mother, Family Guy, where we see the comedy of a trans person being in the evocation of disgust around romantic or sexual entanglement with a main character. A concept that is also a key part of a very notorious legal process called the trans panic defense, where it is argued that a cis man will feel such intense rage and fear at a discovery like this and will not be able to control his actions. It's the same logic that leads to cis men doing horrible violence on trans women that they find attractive or they have any kind of liaisons with, as a form of punishment for a perceived crime. It's fucked up is what it is, and shows like Big Bang Theory here help to work into that. But the other angle one could perceive this from when it comes to specifically Stuart, and an angle that is more unique to Big Bang Theory, is that he is a character who is persistently getting screwed over, and so the comedy here is not just on the imaginary trans person behind the line, but also on Stuart.
And you couldn't put it out. I was across the street at the do-it-yourself car wash taking a shower.
But even in that way, the way of we are laughing at Stuart because he made out with a guy he thought was a girl, LOL, is still at its core reliant upon the same transphobic notions, and inspires the same attitudes that we just mentioned. It says, you, cis straight man, are a sap, just like Stuart if this happens to you, and people should laugh at you, so what are you gonna do about it? But now we skip ahead to our second example that reinforces this case, from Season 4's Episode 5, The Desperation Emanation, which is all about how Sheldon, Howard and Raj have girl kind of friends, and Leonard doesn't, and so is desperately trying to do something about it, which is honestly just a consistent theme of the early seasons, and is actually a big part of that whole toxic masculinity.
Why don't you just break up with her?
No, I can't.
Why not?
'Cause then I'd be alone, like you.
Like, we see how badly these people are willing to do anything for the mere touch of a woman, including stalking and harassment and other things that would absolutely make them the villain of the piece if they were not a bunch of harmless nerds whose lack of physical strength is supposed to make them not a threat.
You know what? If it's creepy to use the internet, military satellites, and robot aircraft to find a house full of gorgeous young models so that I can drop in on them unexpectedly, then fine, I'm creepy.
Which just isn't true to the real world, but it does help to reinforce a bunch of shitty things that affect real women and the real men who make their real lives real hell, so... to the Big Bang Theory on that one. Anyway, Howard has his girlfriend set up Leonard on a date with somebody, per the girlfriend pact that they made. And Leonard has a terrible date that he just isn't enjoying, and so he wants out of it. To which Howard responds with this line about worst dates that he had.
Seriously? I was once robbed by a pre-op transsexual I met on J-Date, and that didn't even crack my top 10.
Now, this leads much more quickly into the joke about how Leonard lies about having self-respect around not just pretending to enjoy a girl's company to sleep with her, because he totally gets on board with spending more time with this girl because she might fuck him.
And it's an open bar, so I'll probably be giving it away.
I look forward to it.
Leonard is literally a fuckboy that hides it by pretending to be a nerdy little guy who couldn't do anything to hurt women. He's such a little baby. But more importantly to us here, this throwaway line is another brick on that tower of transphobia that centers itself around how trans people are a joke when it comes to considering them in a sexual or romantic light, and that only desperate guys like Howard, utter sleazebags with zero cares about what it takes to have sex, could be seen engaging with them. It sets the stage for us both laughing at the trans person who gets into the situation and is therefore gross because of the fact that that's a bad date, and also laughing at the people involved for being these desperate little nerds who would fall into those traps, which I use in its most offensive terminology, because of who they are. Our final example on this list of non-appearing trans people as bits is from Season 7's Episode 17, The Friendship Turbulence. And, wait, hang on a damn second. Didn't we just have an episode that used turbulence as well? Oh my god, they ran out of fancy-sounding science words in like 5 years. That's embarrassing. Not as embarrassing as what we're going to discuss, because this episode is kind of an all-about Raj and his desperate need to find a partner episode, being the only consistent member of the group who never really gets a long-term thing going. And I want to get to the transphobic comment as quick as possible, but I also want to stop at the very beginning of this episode, where Raj makes Bernadette, Howard's wife, incredibly uncomfortable by sexually harassing her in front of, like, everybody, including her husband.
Raj, your tag's sticking out.
Thank you. That's the closest I've come to sex in like 2 years.
Now I feel a little gross.
You're only making it seem more real for me.
This would be bad if it was just a single one-off, but the whole Raj trying to get with Bernadette is a recurring theme of a lot of episodes and seasons, and the show rarely goes into how shitty it is, because if they did, well, then they would have to acknowledge all the other stuff, I guess, as well, that makes these people not lovable goofs with no smooth moves, but reprehensible monsters that make women's lives hell. And that's a hard thing to sell to Middle America, so I can see why Big Bang Theory avoided recognizing it and just sort of swept it under the rug. Anyway, back to the episode and to Raj. He gets inspired to go back into online dating sites and finds this woman who is perfect as far as he is concerned, and he says this completely out of nowhere and honestly completely unnecessary line.
And judging by her lack of Adam's apple, she's been female her entire life. I like that in a woman.
This is actually quite similar to the previous examples that we've seen so far, with Stuart, with Howard, in that what it gives us is this insight into firstly the idea that dating a trans woman is a joke, and there is something wrong or gross about it, an attitude that is very present in cis media, as you might have realised by this point. But alongside that, I do think it's fascinating how each of the characters who we are meant to be laughing at for being either desperate horny creeps, or sad desperate loners, or effeminate desperate fuckboys, have all clearly had some interaction with a trans woman at some point. They've clearly been involved with either talking to or discovering that they were talking to one, and that has impacted their perception on dating to the degree that they bring it up when considering future partners. These toxic males really do represent that toxicity quite well, as we see here them consistently supporting the fear that many men have about trans women in the dating pool. And while we are here, I just want to quickly tear into the stupid transphobia at play, which is a commonly used joke in transphobic bits, and that is the fact that cis women can also have Adam's apples. It's a bit of a misnomer term, really, because while yes, it is more common for a prominent larynx to exist in men, much like most of the human biological spectrum, that shit ain't set in stone. Men can have flat throats, and that doesn't make them secretly women, and vice versa. It's sort of just a harmful stereotype that leads to cis women as well, who deal with that, feeling worse about themselves, because they get attacked for not being real women alongside the trans women who it's intended to target. So those are the comedic bits and jokes that feature trans women or trans adjacent individuals in merely the abstract idea of them. And it's worth noting how in almost all of the cases so far, they've clearly involved trans women, but the terminology around it has clearly been done in such a way to deny any womanhood to those people, to really cement the image of them as men in dress-up.
You know I'm a dude, right? I'm a pre-op transsexual.
And judging by her lack of Adam's apple, she's been female her entire life.
And that might feel like I'm trying to lead us into a point here, and that's because I am. Well done. Very insightful of you. Because our final big point of this Big Bang Theory trans video is the discussion of Louise or Louis, a trans individual who does literally appear as well as get mentioned. So, who the hell are they? Well, Louis or Louise, because much like many media at this time, it's not particularly clear exactly how we're meant to be interpreting this person. Partly, probably because the writers didn't know, and partly because the characters who we see them viewed through are at best unreliable narrators of queer identity, and are at worst subconsciously bigoted pieces of shit, who don't address that at all for 12 fucking years. But Louis, or Louise, is mentioned at the very beginning, in the very first episode of the entire darn show, when Leonard and Sheldon see Penny moving in, and Leonard makes a comment about how this attractive young lady is a significant improvement over their previous neighbour, to which Sheldon gives us the punchline,
200-pound transvestite with a skin condition? Yes, she is.
That's how we get put into this show. And I say we here as kind of a general inclusive statement of all the people under the trans umbrella, sexuals, vestites, and genders alike. Our difference is a joke, is a comment on how we are worse than a regular person, even from the perspective of the character whose view on the world is not influenced by their sexual attraction, i.e. Sheldon. A character who not even an episode later in, well, episode 2's The Big Brain Hypothesis, has another exchange with Leonard over the transvestite as they talk about how Sheldon had no complaints around how Louis or Louise kept the place because he kept it immaculate.
When the transvestite lived here, you didn't care how he kept the place.
Because it was immaculate. I mean, you open that man's closet, it was left to right evening gowns, cocktail dresses, and his police uniforms.
What there is here is a significant theme from the Nerd Gang that does play a big part of their consistent setup. A setup that we have really detailed, which is their intense, judgmental cruelty of others for their differences. Which is downplayed because they're also seen as victims of the system too, as nerds. But just because you are nerds and are perceived as being downtrodden from this high school-esque stereotyping, it doesn't really soften the rampant sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia that is so apparent and so consistently used by them to almost drag others down for no other reason than to make themselves feel better, or because that is what the show thinks is comedy. Is bigotry and cruelty comedy? Is a question that I think really needs to be considered when we try to understand the impact that Big Bang Theory and other comedic shows like it have had on audiences. Especially audiences who are so happy to dismiss any criticism by deflection. However, Louis or Louise does not exist as merely a conceptual notion of a trans person, as we do finally get to see them in a physical real space in Season 3's episode 22, The Staircase Implementation, when during a flashback sequence, Leonard accidentally knocks on their door while he is moving in.
Yeah.
Dr. Cooper?
No, you want the crazy guy across the hall.
There is the initial audience laugh reaction at the very physical expression and appearance of Louis or Louise, where the appearance of them is enough to spark a joke, I guess, and then there is the additional comment on top of that around how we are meant to think it's funny that this person is calling someone else crazy. That if they think that is the case, then Sheldon must really be something else. It's a premise that is reliant upon us viewing a transvestite as weird and insane, because otherwise the premise of that joke doesn't really hold weight. If a cis person who was dressed in clothes that didn't spark a reaction answered the door and said the same thing, there would not really be a joke there, right? And that's it. That's all we get. So, where does this leave us then, is a decent question. And I think that it's very apparent that the Big Bang Theory is really reflective of many of the worst ways that sitcoms can incorporate trans people. It really does work to the flaws that are apparent in comedy that relies upon meanness towards minorities to get its audience laughing, and it almost excuses that fact by positioning its characters as equally disadvantaged individuals due to their social status. But these are just famous professors with hobbies that have become mainstream as well by this point. Even before the mainstreaming of nerd culture, those issues are ones that were still not a comfortable inclusion. The ease with which they incorporated all the worst aspects of nerd culture, the aspects that would really come to light with the advent of Gamergate and red pill internet culture. What the Big Bang Theory represents is at the foundation of all of that, and its treatment of trans characters is about in line with what one would expect from it. It reminds me a lot of The Simpsons, to be honest, where The Simpsons also incorporated trans people as mostly visual gags or offhanded offensive comments whose comedy relied upon us finding the very existence of a trans person to be funny. Is it a surprise to say that Big Bang Theory was shit at handling the trans community? No, because let's face it, not many people have high expectations for this show, me included. But our expectations should be higher than where this show sets the bar, and should also take into account the fact that this series was designed to be easy watching, and are very effective at subconsciously encouraging attitudes that are harmful amongst its audience. This show's design as a consumer good works into that so well, and ultimately did have an impact probably on a lot of people and the way they interact with trans people, even offhandedly. So yeah, it is at least worth thinking about it, and sort of taking notes on the Big Bang Theory to try and do better down the line, and to realise how the Big Bang Theory influenced where we are right now as a culture. Anyways, I hope that you learnt something here, or that you enjoyed this, or you got something at least from it. If you did, then a great way to show that is liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, all that YouTube stuff, you know, that people want you to do, me included. If you really like it, then you can do everything in your power to make sure that Big Bang Theory never comes back on air. Let's use that darn cancel culture power that we supposedly have to make at least one positive change in the world, you know? And that positive change should be Big Bang Theory never coming back. If you really, really like what I'm doing, then the best way to show that is by going to my Patreon and subscribing there, or becoming a member on YouTube right here. The names of those in the $5 and up category should be scrolling past the screen right now, and I could not do what I do here without their support, as it really helps me to have some kind of financial security, while making videos without having to be constantly worried about them doing well. Other than all of that, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.